Amphibians are strange. I mean, sure, we've talked about amphibious creatures before, but we've never talked about a true amphibian. And trust me, they can get pretty weird. On top of that, we've also never talked about trait evolutions before, and they're weird in their own right. I mean, think about it. It's an evolution of a natural Pokemon that only occurs when an electrical current is passed through that Pokemon and causes it to evolve. Essentially evolving the Pokemon through electrocution. This happens rarely in the wild, but the evolutions were only really discovered because of the electrical current that's present when you use a trading machine, a man-made object. And then, sometimes, the current also has to pass through a specific item that the Pokemon's holding at the time, or only when they're traded for a specific other Pokemon. Trait evolutions just get really wild. And the fact that today's guide is both an amphibian and has a trait evolution in it, promises to make this a rather interesting guide. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for specific Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Poliwag line. Poliwag itself is a small, 2-foot tall, 27-pound Pokemon with a very round body, no arms, 2 small, underdeveloped feet, and a rudder-shaped tail that helps it move through the water. Its relatively small face is situated at the top of its round body, with the rest of its torso taken up by a white and black spiral pattern, which, grossly enough, is actually its intestines that you can see through its body. This grossly adorable little guy evolves into Poliwhirl, which keeps the same general shape with the round body and the intestine spiral, but now its legs are much more developed, and it has grown arms with hands that look like it's wearing gloves. It now weighs about 44 pounds and stands at 3 feet 3 inches tall. And now, this is where the trait evolution comes in, as this line has the same thing that the Oddish line has, and can evolve into 2 separate final forms, depending on what method you take. The more well-known and easier to do evolution is Poliwrath, which is what you'll get if you use a water stone on your Poliwhirl. Poliwrath has almost the exact same body shape and body plan as Poliwhirl, but it gains the fighting type, and thus it's much bulkier, which shows now that it stands nearly 4 feet tall and weighs close to 120 pounds. However, the other evolution changes the pattern up drastically. Politoed now has much more of a frog-like body, with very well-developed legs for jumping. Its skin tone is changed to a light green color with splashes of yellow, mainly where the spiral pattern is. It now no longer shows the Pokemon's inner guts, thank Arceus, but is now just a simple pattern on its belly. It also now has hair, well, really only one strand of hair that comes out of the top of its head and curls at the end, but it's still hair. The way to get this evolution instead of Poliwrath is to either trade your Poliwhirl or get someone else to trade you one to you while it's holding a specific item known as a King's Rock. They're kind of hard to find, but if you manage to get your hands on one, then that's your key to a Politoed. And that's the basic rundown for the Poliwag line. So let's get into the guide and figure out if these are going to be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Clearly, we're going to need water for these Pokemon. The issue becomes that these Pokemon are full-on aquatic amphibians. This means that their body chemistry is highly dependent on and affected by their surrounding environment. The 2 main things that we're going to need to consider with the Poliwag line are temperature and water quality. Let's talk about temperature first, as that'll be the easiest of the 2 to cover. These Pokemon are always found in warmer environments, as they are not built biologically to withstand the cold or extreme temperatures. Being amphibians, the Poliwag line is endothermic, meaning that they can't regulate their own internal body temperature and depend on environmental factors to keep their bodies at the optimal temperature. Also, as they evolve and their biology shifts to become more and more terrestrial, their ideal temperature changes as well. With Poliwag, the ideal water and environmental temperature that you're going to be looking for is going to be between 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. This will help to facilitate their growth and their development. When they evolve and thus begin spending more time on land, then they prefer a temperature that ranges from 75 to 85 degrees. As I'm sure you can tell, these are temperatures that are very high and very specific, meaning that in a lot of places around the world, you won't be able to keep this Pokemon in any old pond in your yard. And before you start writing comments saying that Kanto gets plenty of cold in the winter, remember that these guides are about the best and optimal way to keep your Pokemon. Yes, the Pokemon in this line can make it through hard winter months by going into hibernation. It should also be noted that this is very dangerous for these Pokemon, and plenty of individuals of this species don't make it through the winter. So let's not consider allowing your Pokemon to try and make it through the hard climates, yeah? Meaning that, once again, I'm going to recommend building a fully enclosed enclosure for your Pokemon. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's get into that other stipulation that I was talking about, water quality. See, the reason that the water quality affects these Pokemon so much is the fact that their skin is much more porous than most other Pokemon. This means that while water can get through, any chemicals, minerals, or diseases that are present in the water can get through just as well. Meaning that you'll have to be very careful about what water you use to fill their pond. One thing to look out for is the normal chemicals that are in tap water, like the trace amounts of chlorine and fluoride. While harmless to us and most other Pokemon, to amphibians, even the smallest amount of these chemicals can lead to health problems. But that's not to say that you can use distilled water either. Distilled water has had all things pulled out of it, so while it doesn't have any chemical compounds in it, it also is lacking most of the natural minerals and salts that normal water picks up from the ground and rocks. Amphibians rely on that stuff being in the water so they can absorb them through their skin. So just putting in water that's been purged of everything would be terrible for their health. But also keep in mind that having too much of these natural minerals could also make the water too toxic for them. It's a very delicate balancing act, just like the pH of the water. For those of you that haven't taken chemistry in a long time, the pH of a liquid measures how acidic the water is. The lower the number, the higher the acidity is present in the water. But you also don't want the pH to get too high, as that means the water is becoming too basic, the opposite of acidic. Really, what you're looking for when you test for pH is something right in the middle, between a 6.5 and an 8. Really, you want to keep it as close to 7 as possible, as that's right in the middle of the pH scale, and it's the optimum spot for the water, but really, anywhere in that range they can handle. But that's still not everything about the water. You also have to make sure that the water stays well aerated. Since most amphibians at least partially draw their oxygen from the water, that means that there needs to be a sufficient supply of oxygen in the water. Thankfully, this is an easy fix. You just have to add in one of those bubble machines that people tend to get for their fish tanks or ponds. But it's just one more thing that you'll need to keep track of to make sure that the water in the enclosure does not end up becoming a hazard to the Pokemon. And so, with all of that stuff kept in mind, let's get into the actual construction of the enclosure and how it's going to be laid out. To start, this is going to be another enclosed enclosure, just like Paris and Venonat. The reason being for that is manifold. There's the temperature, humidity, and air quality that you have to consider. For example, amphibians function best when they're in a warmer environment. For the juvenile stage like Poliwag, they need it slightly less warm, keeping it around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, once they evolve into one of their later stages, you'll have to crank the temperature up to between 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. In all, that's a really warm enclosure, hence why we're going to be building a full-on building for these Pokemon. Most regions, excluding Alola, don't stay that warm all year round. And as we've already covered, keeping these Pokemon outside for the winter could be very dangerous for their health. And so, since the winter is such a dangerous thing for these Pokemon to experience, we're going to be building a place where they don't have to worry about it at all. As well, a building will keep the humidity inside much better than just hoping that the outside conditions are just right. Especially since you're aiming for a humidity level of 80 to 90% all of the time, which will be really hard to get correct if you just have it out in the open. The dimensions of the building that we're going to be looking at are going to be 25 by 25 feet and 10 feet tall. Really, almost a cube. The sides can be whatever you want them to be, whether that be glass, PVC, or Pokemon-safe plastic. Just be aware that whatever it is going to be getting very wet thanks to the humidity. Also, if you don't get a semi-clear substance like the glass or the plastic, you'll need to hang some UVB lights from the ceiling, as they do need that light for a few needed biological functions. On one wall, you're going to install a door that you can enter the enclosure from, one that's decently sealed, so that it keeps the heat and the humidity in. You'll also need to install the heating system, one that can handle the water that's going to be in the air and can be sure to run all the time at such a high temperature. Really, I would suggest getting one of those central heating systems installed, as they seem to be the best for this kind of situation. And now for the water, the main part of the enclosure. Half of this enclosure's floor is going to be taken up by the pond, but you don't really want to just dig into the ground and fill the hole with water, as that can lead to structural issues with the building, and could lead to the water becoming very filthy. So instead, what we're going to do is build something that's almost like a pool. You'll dig down to excavate the area where the pond will be, which should be along the wall opposite the door. And then you'll pour down a layer of water-resistant concrete and then cover that with a waterproof tarp that you'll then anchor so it doesn't slip around. This will prevent any of the concrete dust from making its way into the water, and it will also prevent the water from eroding the concrete over time. The shape of the pool should follow the far wall, being square on 3 sides, with the final side, the side that's coming towards the door, slowly sloping upward, growing shallower and shallower as it goes. This provides your Pokemon an easy way to get in and out of the water, which is especially good for Poliwag and Poliwhirl, as they're a lot less practiced with their legs. The deeper end, the end that'll be along the back of the wall, should reach a depth between 10 to 15 feet. Deep enough for the Pokemon to swim around freely without being too deep. And don't forget to install a filter and the aerator for the pond as you're setting them up, as they'll be much more difficult to set up once the pond has already been built and filled. Then, once it's complete, you'll need to fill it with water that meets all the specifications that I mentioned above. That can be pretty tricky to do on your own, so the best method may be to have a company come in and fill the pond for you, if you don't have one come in to build the rest of the enclosure already. Once the pond has been filled, and you're sure that the filter and aerator are working properly, you should decorate the pond with a few fake plants. A few grasses along the bottom, a few flowers along the rim of the pond, and especially a few lily pads that are anchored down to the bottom of the pond. This will provide your Pokemon with a more natural environment to live in than just an empty bowl of water. Just be sure to get the fake plants though, as the real ones can start to die off at some point and rot and lead to nasty side effects in your pond. The last part of the physical enclosure that we're going to talk about is the other side of the floor. Between the door and the pond, you should have a simple grass lawn between the two. This will allow for any water that gets spilled over the side to get absorbed by the grass, and provide a nice, natural space for your Pokemon to hang out when they're outside the water. Especially for Poliwag, as they're always eager to explore the land with their rudimentary legs. And you don't have to worry about reinforcing the ground, as these Pokemon aren't known for their abilities to dig or change the surrounding earth. So at least you don't have to worry about them breaking out by digging through the ground. The last major thing that we'll be talking about are the other Pokemon lines that can be housed with the Poliwag line. Other Poliwag line Pokemon are a perfect fit for them. They get along very well with each other, and Politoed are even known to hang out with each other on the water's edge. Aside from that, you're going to be looking for water-type Pokemon that are generally well-tempered and won't consider the smaller Pokemon of this line as prey. So things like the Slowpoke line, the Marill line, and the Wooper line, just to name a few. Though, I would avoid Pokemon like the Totodile line and the Buizel line, as they may make prey out of your Poliwag or your Poliwhirl. Fire and electric types might also be a bad idea, as they don't really get along well with the water typing of this line, though for different reasons of each. As well, many small bug-type Pokemon would be a bad idea, as after the Poliwag stage, these evolutions become carnivorous. Speaking of which, Poliwag would be bad to house with some of the smaller grass-type Pokemon, as it's the only member of this line that's a herbivore, and the grass types would do a lot of damage to the small guys if they get upset enough to attack. And always be aware that the enclosure that I described for this guide is only set up for one Pokemon. So if you are planning on adding in more of any type, be sure to expand the enclosure to accommodate the new Pokemon's needs. Availability. These guys are absolutely a Kanto region Pokemon. Like, there are some Pokemon that we've covered that are in the Kanto Pokedex that really aren't available there. The Sandshrew line pops into my mind when I think about it. But these guys, the Poliwag line, they are everywhere in the Kanto region. If you can find a body of fresh water, then you can find one of these Pokemon. At least, that's the case with the first two evolutions. Poliwrath is harder to find, as that means that a Poliwhirl would need to come into contact with a water stone in the wild, which, I mean, isn't an impossibility, but it's not something that'll happen often at all. But that might be a good thing, as they're the only ones that gain the fighting type, so they don't really have that relaxed and calm attitude that its previous two evolutions have. And the rarest member of this line is Politoed, and for good reason. Being trade evolutions, these Pokemon are exceptionally rare in the wild. If you do find one, then it's most likely a Pokemon that a trainer released for some reason. There's a small possibility that a wild Poliwhirl experienced an electric current while holding the King's Rock, probably by being shocked by an electric-type Pokemon, but that's such a specific circumstance that it hardly ever happens. As for the breeder scene, there is a decent market for these Pokemon. Despite their high enclosure requirements, they're very easy to house with each other, and for the people out there that enjoy having amphibians as pets, then these are some of the best ones that you can get in that regard. That popularity means that any breeder that wants to raise them will find a ready and willing market to sell to. And because of that, it's very easy for you to find somewhere to buy one. Sure, it might cost you a bit more to get one of the final evolutions, but I'm sure there are plenty of breeders out there that would be willing to buy one of the needed items for the evolution. Of course, as a trade evolution, a breeder might be your only way of getting a Politoed, unless you're very, very lucky in the wild. And always remember, I recommend getting a breeder-raised Pokemon, as then they're more used to being around people, and you can be sure that you'll be getting a good, healthy Pokemon in the end. Care. You know, it wasn't until I was this far into the guide that I realized we're very far into it, and we've only really talked about the enclosure. And for good reason, as there are so many complex things that go into the enclosure for these kinds of Pokemon. But luckily, the inverse is true for the care section of this video. There really isn't that much that you have to do to take care of them, and most of it is taking care of the enclosure. For example, you will have to regularly check and take care of the pH of the water. The tests to do so are pretty easy to get a hold of and cheap to buy, but test it often, at least once a week. If you notice that the pH starts to change, then you can take steps to get it corrected, whether that be emptying the pond and replacing it with new water, though that can be expensive, or you can just get chemicals that can be used to adjust the pH back to what it should be. Just, if you're going to be using that way, be sure to look up how those chemicals will interact with the amphibian Pokemon, and more importantly, be sure to find out how long it takes for those chemicals to dissipate in water. Just always remember that when you're doing this, remove the Pokemon from the environment and place them either in their Pokeball or in a separate space while you wait for the chemicals to dissipate and the pH to return to normal. After that, you'll also need to make sure that you keep the rest of the enclosure clean. With how high the heat and humidity are, there's a good chance for different things to start growing in the enclosure. It'll be a perfect environment for things like algae to grow. It would be best for you to clean the enclosure at least once a week to prevent any buildup of bacteria or something of the like. Again, the best way to handle this would be to remove the Pokemon from the enclosure and dilute a cleaning product in water and then use that to clean the rest of the enclosure. Afterward, use warm water to clean off any residue left from the cleaner and allow that to dry completely before reintroducing the Pokemon to the enclosure. Speaking of making sure that things are always clean, always be sure to clean yourself before and after entering the enclosure. Since these Pokemon are so susceptible to their environments, you can very easily bring in something on your skin or your clothes that could make your Pokemon sick. So before you enter the enclosure to interact with them, be sure to clean yourself and any clothes that you're wearing. But aside from just being sure to keep things clean and healthy, it's only regular maintenance that you have to do, like make sure the heat keeps working and the water systems don't break. It's small things that you have to do daily, but it will be daily. As for interacting with these Pokemon, there really isn't much that you can do with these guys. They don't really interact with people to the level of Pokemon like Growlithe or Meowth, but then again, they aren't exactly Pokemon that you shouldn't go near, like Venonat or Paris. At most, these Pokemon will bond with you, but the only way that they'll show it is by approaching you and hanging out with you when you enter their enclosure. Just some words of advice: don't go swimming in the pond. No matter how clean you may be getting, no matter how well you scrub yourself down before coming into the enclosure, there is always the chance that you missed something, and introducing that to the water is a quick way to get your Pokemon sick. Also, be sure not to hang out in the enclosure for too long. With the high humidity and heat, staying in there too long could be detrimental to your health. The level of water in the air just isn't good for human lungs. And after that, really the last part of caring for your Poliwag evolution is gonna be the food. This is another interesting case where the younger evolution has a completely different diet than the later evolutions. Poliwag, being the youngest stage that it is herbivorous, meaning it only eats the plants and berries that'll grow in or near the water. So the best things to feed them are things like lettuce, spinach, or broccoli. The best way to serve them this food is to actually boil it first in fresh water, as this will get rid of any harmful bacteria that's in the plant, and it'll also soften the veggies up for the Pokemon. Unfortunately, there really isn't any amount that I could find online of how much you're supposed to feed Poliwag, but most of the advice I found was to keep an eye on them when you feed them. If they don't eat everything, then reduce the amount you feed them, and if it seems that your Pokemon has less energy and is starting to lose weight, then feed them some more. Also, thanks to their slower metabolism, you'll only need to feed them every 3 to 4 days, which is nice on your wallet. When we talk about the later evolutions from Poliwhirl and up, they switch from having a herbivorous diet to a carnivorous one. They begin to prey on small bug-type Pokemon like Cutiefly and Burmy. They may also go after Caterpie and Dewpider if they're on the smaller side, but that's only if those are smaller Pokemon. A lot of times, Caterpie and Dewpider are too big for them. And with that, we come to the unfortunate truth behind amphibian Pokemon. They need to eat live prey. That's one of the reasons that I didn't mention Joltik among those Pokemon, as the electric typing would be bad for your Poliwag evolution to run into. I know that feeding live prey to your Pokemon isn't for everyone. It's a tough thing to do, but amphibians need their prey to be alive and moving. This is, once again, thanks to their biology, as amphibians are attracted to moving prey. If you just give them some bug meat, then they'll ignore it and not even think of it as food. So if that ends up being a deal breaker, then I totally get it. Live feeding isn't for everyone. But for those of you that are okay with doing it, then you'll be feeding your Poliwhirl and Politoad 2 to 3 times a week, and your Poliwrath between 4 to 5 times a week, as it is bigger, and thanks to its fighting type, does tend to move around more and burn more energy. Again, there's no real information on how much you're supposed to feed these Pokemon per feeding, so once again, you'll need to eyeball whether your Pokemon needs more or less food per feeding. Now, I wanted to expand on something that I just mentioned, and that would be Poliwrath. It's the only member of this line that ends up getting a secondary typing as it evolves. After evolving, it gains the fighting type, and its body becomes made primarily of thick, dense muscle. It also takes on a more active attitude, exercising and swimming around a lot more. This exercise is very important to this Pokemon as it's good for their healthy development. But that also means that you're going to have to make sure that they get plenty of exercise. Their enclosure is big enough for them to get some mild exercise in, but that means that at least 3 to 4 times a week, you will have to take it out of its enclosure and take it somewhere where it can get a good workout in. It could be a nearby lake where it can swim around, or a nearby Pokemon gym, just so long as you provide them with a space that they can get a good workout in of at least 2 hours long. It may not seem like much, but it's something that will have major health benefits for the Pokemon. Cost. The enclosure is going to be your biggest expense here. As ever, when we're talking about erecting a full-on building to house your Pokemon, it won't come cheap. Add in the expense of needing to put in the pool for the water typing of this line, and you're sitting squarely in the very high category. It might not be as much as the pools of the other water-type Pokemon, like Golduck or Blastoise, but the maintenance on it is going to be way more than with those enclosures, leading to a higher monthly cost as well. The food, though, won't be too bad. Sure, the fact that you need the food live will make the price jump up a bit, but they are small bug-type Pokemon. It's not like they're rare or hard to get a hold of. Add in the fact that Poliwag and its evolutions don't eat every day, and you're looking at something in the moderate category per month. Now, depending on what evolution you're planning on getting, they could cost you anywhere between the moderate to the very high categories. Poliwag and Poliwhirl are the ones at the moderate end of the spectrum, and that price is mostly because of the specialized needs in the enclosure. Poliwrath will be around the high category because of the cost of the stone will push it up somewhat, and Politoad will be the most expensive one out of all of them. Again, because the King's Rock, which is harder to find than a water stone, it'll bring up the price much more. So it's really dependent on what form you want to get. Or you could go out and catch one, which wouldn't be too bad for these guys as the lower evolutions are pretty easy to find. Conclusion. Amphibians like this can really be hit or miss with many people. Plenty of people just can't stand how specialized their enclosure needs to be, or how they need to eat live food, or the fact that they can tend to feel a bit slimy to the touch since they live in such a humid environment. And I totally get that. Those are very valid reasons not to like these Pokemon. But if those things aren't deal breakers for you, then these could very easily make great pets for you. Low maintenance and easy to just hang around with, I know plenty of people that simply love the Poliwag line for how calm and easygoing they can be. In the end, I would say that these are not Pokemon for beginners who are looking for their first or second Pokemon, but you don't need to be an expert to raise them either. It's a very good intermediate Pokemon line that could very well end up becoming the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the super smart psychic-type Pokemon Abra and its evolutions Kadabra and Alakazam. Have a wonderful night, everyone.